Hello, 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 and welcome to episode number 12 of Fast Casual, Landa's official podcast, brought to you live today, Wednesday, September 20, from a whole host of places as usual, Irvine, California, New York City, and Ireland today, and hopefully one of the last times I broadcast from Ireland. My name is Alex Mann, and I'm your host again, and it's great to be back this week. Like I say, every week, every restaurant has a story, and so without further delay, let's get the show on the road. I'm delighted to say we've got our CEO, Vivian Wang, again here today. She's always here. Say hi, Vivian.
Hi, good to see everyone.
And we'll all be chatting with Carl Osbourn, who's the co-founder, chief operating officer of JUICER, consultant, author, podcast legend. I mean, there's a million titles that you've got there. Carl, do you want to say hi?
Hi, everyone. Nice to see you guys. Thanks for having me on today.
All right, great stuff. And I suppose, as usual, Vivian, do you want to give a quick little primer to tell everyone who you are?
Yeah, so we help restaurants with hiring, team members up to managers, help combat turnover, all those fun topics right now in the restaurant industry.
Yeah, sweet. And what about yourself, Carl? Do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so my background is largely in C-stores, actually, multi-unit retail. Got into restaurants about 6 or so years ago, initially in the ghost kitchen space, helping Kitchen United build out their operating model. And then I wrote a couple of books. Here they are. You ready? I'm going to hold them up. Delivering the Digital Restaurants. The first one, your Roadmap to the Future of Food. And then this one came out a few months ago, The Path to Digital Maturity, which I'm sure we'll get into. Wrote those two. The first one came out in the middle of the pandemic, and it went crazy because everyone had to embrace digitization. Everyone became a ghost kitchen, and it really kind of propelled me to be a bit of a thought leader in the space. And now, through that, I got to meet my fellow co-founders at JUICER. We're a dynamic pricing company for restaurants. We help the industry up their game when it comes to pricing, and no doubt we'll talk a bit more about that too.
Sweet. So I actually got the book on Audible, as I was telling you just there in pre-production, and I gave the whole thing a listen, and I was probably the most intent I've ever had on doing research on any guest we've ever had, because I listened to the whole thing. But one of the things that, the only listener. No, I'm joking. One of the great things I kind of thought from it was the chapters 3 and 4 were very, very interesting. And I think we can really speak to those in this because I think they're very fascinating. They have, like, the topics themselves are quite interesting for the type of audience that we have in this podcast. But they also interested me personally as a marketer. For those that don't have the book, chapter 3 is all about data mining, which I think from like a restaurant perspective is like, I would say almost like a revolutionary kind of prospect in a way that, like, when I worked in marketing in 2012 and 2011, 2013, like, there wasn't, like, customer data platforms were becoming a thing for gigantic brands, like really understanding one-to-one marketing was a very nouveau sort of concept. And, listening to this chapter, when you refer to like the restaurant business as effectively an e-commerce business now, I'm really thinking about restaurants as a sort of like, numbers business, like as in anything can be assigned a metric, and what are the right metrics to really understand businesses. For me, one major problem in brands is getting people to actually like even understand the data. Like you refer to this a lot in the chapter itself. Like there's so much data, there's so many ways you can slice and dice the data, like matrices for different like ways of understanding. Just like a mountain of it. And, for me, when I think about it, it's like, how do you get people to understand the data? How do you even get started with data? And one of the kind of things you spoke to, which I think yourself and Vivian would have an awful lot to speak to right now, is you speak a lot about like hours data in particular, that's what you call it. Like how do restaurants like manage like hours from a data perspective, and using data to really manage schedules and optimize those. And I suppose we'll kick it off there on your sort of like your take on my take, and then we can kind of go from there.
Yeah. Well, look, I think the reality is that restaurant executives are drowning in data. They have lots of it. They've always had lots of it in many ways, but actually now it's a case of how can they use this data to make better decisions. And so I was facilitating a session with 13 different CIOs last week, and from brands with 1,000+ sites to those with a few hundred, and all of them talked about the challenge of data. And also they spoke about the fact that every member of the C-suite of a restaurant organization today is struggling with this as well. It's not just the CTO, it's not the CIO. And as an operator in my past, when we talk about labor and we talk about hours allocation, this is so critical. I mean, I remember the days when I was running some C-store locations, having a spreadsheet and trying to figure out and plot different people and the hours I would waste and my managers would waste trying to be able to figure out what fitted when was a real problem. Now, fast forward to where we are today, whether it be for restaurants, or retailers, or whoever, the ability of technology to be able to help us not only manage that data in a more seamless fashion, not to necessarily work with the spreadsheet, but now to get to a point where we can actually forecast and understand what we need when is so important and so helpful. And this can be applied, I think, in so many different ways. The other side of this, and I facilitated a session at FS Tech a couple of years ago on the labor crisis. And I remember speaking to a couple of COOs on that panel there, and they were saying the problem that we have today is that the folks that are working in our restaurants, they want more flexibility. They want to be able to communicate with each other through technology, and they want to be able to swap shifts through that same technology. So even if you just had a great system with a great forecast and the ability to say, right, this is exactly what I need right now for my week ahead or my month ahead, that isn't always the way it works out, because people are going to want to swap and shift. So there's the ability to forecast, I think, when it comes to data, but there's also then the ability to adjust to the reality that our employees working in our restaurants also have things that mess around their schedules. And so we have to adapt and be agile to that too.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Vivian, you were going to speak?
Yeah. I mean, I think like on the data front, there's so much data. And then, but at the same time, like even like looking in at the data coming, garbage in, garbage out, like philosophy, right? Like what is the data that we're collecting? Because they're like, I think it kind of comes down to what we hear a lot is, we want to have that data. We have all this other data, and it's kind of random and noisy. Have some of my locations report the data, others don't. And then we're trying to glean insights from it. And then turns out like the data's not really super usable in the first place because the collection method is not great. Because, things like sales numbers are really straightforward, right? You just go to your POS. I mean, I say that probably not that straightforward, but you go into your POS and you're able to pull like, okay, top line numbers, bottom line numbers, like later on. But for when I hear things about like labor, for example, on turnover and ghosting rates, turnover is a number that actually like you would imagine every single restaurant should be tracking at the per role, per location level. But oftentimes it's like it's really messy because the systems don't have a way to actually demonstrate that data to you in a usable way, or like the data is messy because it requires manual inputs. So it requires like a bunch of different people to be inputting the data real time. So I think that one of the big things is just like making sure that you actually have like good data and like comprehensive data that you're analyzing. It doesn't have to be 100% of what you need to make a conclusion, but like get to like that 50-60% rather than just like, I see a lot of companies making data-driven decisions, quote unquote, off of like anecdata, I call it. It's just like, I heard this story, I heard this from my GM, so we need to change this. So anecdata versus like true data and how you collect it.
I think that's so true. And part of what we try to do at JUICER is look for trends in sales data, but also in trends of what else is happening in the environment that the restaurant is operating in. And for example, that could be local sports games, it could be weather. And all of these things, of course, can affect the traffic in real time. Now, we often, I think, skimp past the fact that the very best GMs of restaurants are those that have that ability to make agile decisions in the moment. And so if the restaurant GM knows that in a particular beachside location, it's going to be a terrible thunderstorm tonight, then guess what? The usual profile for that restaurant staff labor might be different because they're not expecting as many people in. Or maybe he's going to be expecting more food deliveries. And so therefore he might need more folks in the back of house versus the front of house. So I think there's also an angle here of not just managing the sales forecast and the sales profile, but actually understand how do you accommodate the different things that are happening in your environment. The example I've used recently, we looked at Super Bowl Sunday. We studied 1,000 restaurants and 1,000 restaurants over 16 different states. Now, I am pretty sure that those 1,000 restaurants all had an idea that Super Bowl Sunday is going to probably be busier. And so they probably heightened their inventory levels. They probably actually hired a few extra folks in to, to run the floor, etc., on that day. But how many of them changed price, do you think, Vivian? How many do you think changed price on Super Bowl Sunday?
Probably pretty low. Like,
you're right.
Like 10% maybe?
None. Not one of the 1,000 restaurants changed price. And so it's interesting, isn't it? Because the logic of Super Bowl Sunday would tell the average GM, okay, I should absolutely change my labor profile. But how does it apply to other elements across the operation? And I think this is where we're trying to bring the same logic that you're doing from the labor profile into the pricing and revenue management side.
I guess one of the things you were saying, one of the things I was hearing when I'm hearing as opposed to reading, like effectively this, which is like pricing has, like you were talking about, since like, inflation remaining stagnant for 40 years or whichever you're saying, that like real food costs have been pretty, like, other than like a kind of meteorite sort of commodity issue like in beef or whichever, has been maintained its like relative kind of pricing the whole time. And it, like, in one sense, it's almost like sacrosanct or sacred to like impact like the price like on the menu per se, like as in not thinking about it as a sort of a dynamic thing that can also change, in the sense that other factors within the organization you play around with pricing, but not necessarily like food. Why is that, you think? Like, why is there like a cultural norm around that?
Well, I think part of the challenge is ultimately about connecting the dots, right? We all know in restaurant technology today that in spite of the great functionality that our respective organizations are bringing to the restaurants, it's about how our respective technologies talk to each other and how they can help each other in their various different ways. You might recall, Alex, I think it was in the back of the book where we talked about the concept of holistic technology. And imagine the situation of how, and I think the example I used in the book was, imagine we have 2 line cooks that call out tonight. Now, today's technology stack typically will probably interact with a system like your own, payroll, those types of systems. And that's probably where it will end. But imagine if that could feed out to OpenTable to restrict the amount of table reservations tonight. Imagine it could go to someone like JUICER, so therefore we could quench some of the demand while optimizing the revenue, so that way the kitchen can still cope. The ability for us to be able to create a symbiotic system whereby different technologies talk to each other, I think is really, powerful. I've been talking to some of the largest food suppliers out there, the Cargills, the US Foods, the Cisco's, for example, about how when inventory food costs change, today, a lot of what they have to do is hedge their bets. They have to think about, well, what's happening to proteins, and do we buy in advance now? Much like I had to do an A&PM when we had to buy hundreds of millions of dollars of coffee in advance when we thought the coffee market was going up. That's what a lot of the food suppliers are doing today, knowing that the restaurants today can't change their prices more than once or twice a year because they've got all these physical menus everywhere. So I see a world where you potentially can have almost a value chain that flows all the way through from cost of product and the supply side all the way through to the menus, and actually then creating a system whereby you can actually maintain the margins you want based on the cost of product you're receiving. But again, the technology needs to speak to each other.
Okay, Vivian, you gonna say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say that, like, I mean, that's one of the big things with like these integrations, especially when we're looking at like larger groups that we work with, is that, you have all these different systems, and you need the systems to speak to each other in real time. Oftentimes, a lot of these systems like don't, and it's kind of a surprising thing. But when you're working with like a lot of data, and I think a lot of companies right now are kind of going out and rethinking their technology stack. They're going out and they're like, okay, first requirement is that it integrates with our existing system. I think that's something that everybody should be looking for when they're bringing on any new piece of technology, because no matter how amazing it looks, if it doesn't integrate with the system, it's like you have this Mercedes out there, but then, it like, say you have a giant truck, it doesn't even fit into your garage. Like, no, it's not going to work. Like, no one's going to be going there. I think realistically, when you look at operators don't have much time to like learn new systems. And even though like it might make sense for the support center to think, okay, this would help them, like developing a focus group for those operators and showing them like how it's going to fit into existing systems, probably cut down on their existing processes. Like that's really like what folks should be looking at. Like just number one, make sure that what you're bringing on actually connects to your existing systems. And then from there, then like, you know, cut that down to a short list and then make a decision from there. Of course, like if there are any like amazing solutions out there, like keep them in your back pocket for future, because they, you know, they might evolve and they might start to do those integrations. But like just using that as like the first line of filtering is super important.
It's funny you mentioned that. I was speaking to some conference organizers recently. Vivian and I are often meet each other, not on these kind of calls, Alex, but usually amidst the corridors of conferences. And I was talking to a few recently about, wouldn't it be amazing if in the bottom right-hand corner of every booth of each of these conference halls and these technology companies that are trying to sell themselves to everyone, for there to be a very common legend, being able to say, these are the systems that we integrate with. These are the target customers that we are best suited for. So it helps the restaurant owner operator almost qualify themselves or disqualify themselves from the appropriate provider. I think that would be so helpful to be able to address what you were just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, like some kind of standardization of that for sure.
If it happens, it was announced here first. They won't give me
yes.
Well, I can say keep an eye on the gotlanded.com website, because you might see some things like that coming in our website revamp that is coming very, very shortly. A little legend of all those kind of things. But I don't want to say too much about our website for now, you know. But that will be coming. One of the things as well that I thought was quite fascinating as well, Carl, was like, you know, thinking about like the actual metrics that business kind of, like you talk about ROAS and return on ad spend, and obviously as a marketer, Vivian's crushing me constantly on my own ROAS for Landed, and I was listening to it and I was kind of like, oh, okay, cool, this is really pushing the sort of like understanding ROAS for restaurant businesses in particular. And you were talking about a 10x ROAS and like a 10 to 1. It was a 10 to 1 CAC LTV, and I was like, whoa, okay. And you spoke like you were trying to allude to like why it needs to be so high given the kind of low operating margins. And I'm interested in hearing like, you know, your rationale for like why the number is so high, and like how businesses or restaurants need to like figure out how they should even optimize themselves to get to that point of understanding it.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because I think we also said in that book that typically a good ROAS in e-commerce generally is about 4 to 1, right? So, and just for those folks that are listening that perhaps aren't familiar, that basically means for every $4 in revenue, for every $1 in ad spend. That's the general way of you breaking it down. Look, the challenge is that when you look at the restaurant industry, because of the low margins, because of the fact that you've got a real challenge to be able to make sure that your marketing spend is effective, and a lot of that marketing spend can be distributed across a number of different channels, it's almost more important for you to be able to go for a much higher level of ROAS. And so the number actually has come largely because of us speaking to restaurant groups and what they have found to be successful for themselves. The more accomplished digital marketers out there are striving for that kind of number. And I think really it's something which all of us should really have an understanding. First of all, are we even measuring it? You know, the whole idea of this chapter, which is the third chapter of the book, is how effective are we at even being able to track that number itself? And it's an interesting one, because this kind of is more swung towards the CFOs as opposed to the CMOs, because when you look at advertising spend, the advertising spend in a digital context is in a completely different area of the financial picture to what the spend is for the signage outside of a restaurant brick and mortar location, right? Before all this world of digitization happened, it was all about finding the right location and creating this wonderful ambience and having this great outdoor location, maybe a host or hostess to invite you in. And that was your advertising, alongside maybe a few kind of leaflets and pamphlets and direct mail. Now, unfortunately, those costs aren't accommodated in the same way in a ROAS setup. So therefore, it's more of a case here of us being able to say, how much are you truly dedicating to be able to get the right level of focus on your restaurant? Because it's so competitive out there. You know, we've gone from a situation where the yellow pages was super thin for restaurants to, you know, now being so big. And I think what the problem is that we've got restaurants not even being found because they haven't necessarily focused in on putting enough dollars into marketing. Now,
totally.
I think the other side of this is how smart are we getting with regards to how we allocate marketing dollars, but when? So we come back to that subject of data and forecast. You know, on Uber Eats, for example, right now, you can actually create customized campaigns to be able to say, I want to spend this much on this particular promotional mechanic for these particular hours of the week.
Mm-hmm.
Now, how many folks really do that to get to that level of being able to say, well, we know that if we advertise for these 5 hours right here with this heightened level of spend on this particular promotional mechanic, we're going to get a better ROAS. That's the level we need to get to. 90% of restaurants today, well, certainly I'd say on the independent side at least, 90% are probably just saying, right, I'm going to spend $300 and I'm going to do this buy one, get one, and that I'm going to let it run for 2 or 3 weeks and trust in the algorithm. But with better data utilization, we can get better ROAS results.
Are you on mute, Vivian? Oh, sorry.
Oh, no, I was just nodding my head in agreement. I mean, absolutely. ROAS is something that I looked at not just like in today, but even in like the retail days when I was back in retail. ROAS was something but even if you're in like a large enterprise, like a Gap Inc., you'd think that ROAS is like something you could track, but it's really complex because when you have like billboard ads, Super Bowl ads, like you mentioned, how do you track that ROAS? Like, you know, it's gonna manifest as like increases in your organic traffic, you know, all those things. Even on the hiring side, like when we do more awareness-driven campaigns, like you can imagine like social media platforms are a lot more awareness-driven. When that's the case, then you're not going to see it directly be attributed to, say, like TikTok, but you might see actually an increase in just your organic traffic. How do you actually do those attributions? It's like, that's a conversation for another time because you can go deep into that. There are whole companies that try to help you attribute your ROAS at scale. Yeah. But I'm curious, actually, like the new numbers recently have come out on, consumer spending and how the restaurant industry is moving and hospitality industry is moving as a whole. What are your thoughts on, digital? I mean, you're definitely the expert when it comes to digital delivery and like digitizing your restaurant as a whole. You're starting to see potential slight slowdowns in consumer spending. You're starting to see like not as great growth from a like same store sales perspective. So those are things that I like everybody is looking at. Like, how do you predict that like digital ordering and the Uber Eats of the world, like the DoorDashes of the world and all those like optimizations that I can use to tweak, how do you see that like kind of evolving? Now that we're, well past the pandemic and everyone is, kind of in this new mode of operation, how do you like see that evolving as part of the restaurant's strategies?
Great question. I posted a video on LinkedIn just earlier today of me speaking at QSR Evolution a few weeks back, mm-hmm. Where I talked about the omni-channel guest. And I think it's about time that we start thinking about our guests through an omni-channel lens. And so what I mean by that is oftentimes we'll think about the way in which we should market to our customers for on-premise, and that will typically be different posters in the windows of our restaurants and the traditional way in which we would help them be aware of the latest LTO in some way. And then, of course, we'll think about the ways in which we'll try and target our off-premise guests through Uber Eats and DoorDash advertising. But the reality is that our guests don't just come in to enjoy our restaurants through one specific channel. They enjoy them through all the different channels. And so to your point about the distribution of spend, I think actually all we're seeing right now is a great recovery of the restaurant industry from some of its darkest years in recent times, to a point where now customers are saying, look, Delivery is too expensive. We're going through a cost of living crisis,
Yep.
inflation's super high. And you know what? I'm going to go through the pickup channel. I'm going to choose to come and pick it up myself.
Yeah.
Right? And look at pickup numbers. They're doing great from a pickup perspective. The other challenge, of course, is that we've got a lot of choice out there as well. So the question is, how much are folks really making a decision about whether they're going to eat from an alternative restaurant versus choosing to cook themselves? I don't know about you, but I'm still as busy as I was a few years ago. The need for convenience is still as strong as it was back then. And so therefore, it's about how do you create a compelling picture so that you can address the sign of the times. A lot of the more attuned restaurant groups out there are creating a certain part of their menu to be the value-orientated menu. So that way you can actually drive customers still to your particular restaurant, to be able to perhaps have certain items driven just through your first party ordering channel so that you can understand who they are. And I think as those restaurants are getting closer and being able to utilize their guest data to really have a better appreciation of who their guests are. And this really comes back to, Alex, your point about the restaurant industry becoming an e-commerce industry. If we can become an e-commerce industry, then we should look to who is doing e-commerce best. And Amazon are probably some of the best out there, right?
For sure.
And each of our 3 Amazon home screens look different. If Alex, you're someone that always is there on Prime Day, getting all the deals for 50, 60, 60% off, and Vivian, you're getting the one always getting all the top brands from all the fashion designers, because I know you're a stylish lady, and I'm the person that just always loves to buy anything British, then guess what? Amazon and its algorithms are going to position each of our home screens to those types of profiles.
Oh, for sure.
And so therefore, I think that is the direction in which our industry needs to think, because if we can address our buying preferences alongside the fact that we engage with our restaurants across all these different channels, then ultimately we'll be able to create an Amazon-esque experience that's going to be super compelling and is going to encourage people to come back to us time and time again.
Yeah, I love that, because like thinking about the guest as an omni-channel guest is something that, you know, omni-channel is a phrase that you hear all the time in retail, in e-com, in all these different places. But I actually have I can probably count on one hand the number of times that I've heard it, like in the context of hospitality. I think it's all about like digital ordering. It's all about, you know, in restaurant guest experience, but like thinking omni-channel is, I think, going to be probably like the new buzzword of the next, like, you know, many years in the industry, because how do you actually develop, like from a design thinking standpoint, like an actual streamlined user experience, like not user experience, excuse me, I'm thinking tech, but how do you design a streamlined guest experience across all these different platforms? And keeping in mind that you don't necessarily own all the platforms that they're engaging with. That you don't own how you show up on DoorDash. You don't own how you show up in Uber Eats. Maybe if you're big enough, you can work with them. You can work with these third-party providers and get them to make adjustments. But like really like sitting down and like mapping out your guest experience and thinking about it in an omni-channel way. Like, you know, they're engaging with you in different ways. They're engaging like having an understanding of like which channel is more dominant for certain types of guests, and then speaking to them there. But how amazing would it be if I were able to like walk into a restaurant, say it's a QSR, and immediately when we're thinking about technology, it's like, hey, great, like, you know, I maybe type in my loyalty number. Maybe if I don't even have loyalty, they just are able to tell from like my credit card, like, oh, actually, like, I know that Vivian likes to add a cookie every time she eats. And for us, it's pretty low margin. It's pretty low cost for us to just give her a cookie and to develop that loyalty. She didn't buy a cookie this time, but let's just give her one for free when she puts in her credit card. And then that's going to start to develop like a really great experience. And the next time when you haven't heard from me for so long, for maybe like a month or two, next time I go into DoorDash, it's actually like, oh, great. Like, hey, Vivian, like, we know that you're a fan of this. Like, do you want to get one of your favorite cookies and then, you know, order from us? Like, how amazing would that be? That would be just one of those like outstanding, incredible feats of data piping, honestly, more than anything else. But it would also deliver just like such an amazing, like a I know all these hospitality groups we talk to, they're trying to like wow their guests. Like, what is that wow instance? And that would be something that would be like a wow instance.
I agree. Like, I mean, there's a number of things you've just mentioned, which I'll respond to. That the first, it was about just how do we design the restaurant now to be able to accommodate for the omni-channel experience. And you're right. I think restaurants are playing catch up to this. Technology has taken restaurant capabilities beyond what restaurants have actually been able to do. In our first book, there was a chapter called Delivery is the New Drive-Through. And it focused in on the drive-through channel back in the 60s and 70s when, drive-through was the new thing. Everyone was driving cars and everything was, super exciting about the drive-through concept. But can you imagine a McDonald's or a Burger King today that has thought, oh, I know, we've got this great idea for a drive-through. We're going to pop a hole in the side door, and then we're going to try and make it work. They wouldn't be able to make it work unless they adjusted the operation and the entirety of the design of the restaurant to be able to make it happen within the 3 to 4 minutes that those drive-through experiences happens today, right? And that took 10, 15 years, ultimately, for drive-through to become something. And as you'll see in the QSR drive-through studies that they do every year, everyone is trying to take a second or two off to be able to get to the top of the charts and to really optimize it much further.
Yeah.
So for the digital channels, whether that be for pickup or whether that be for delivery, we're in that early innings still of being able to try and say, well, how do we redesign for this thing to be able to accommodate for these multiple channels? Which is why when you're looking at the larger chains today, you're seeing Chick-fil-A just last week talking about now mobile order pickup lanes are going to be separate from their drive-through lanes where they can accommodate it. So that way people that order ahead on their phone can therefore come in and drive through and pick up, much like the Chipotle experience. We're seeing smaller footprints of the on-premise experience to be able to accommodate for these things as well. So we're starting now to see the prototypes of the restaurants of the future change to accommodate what technology has enabled. The second thing you mentioned on third party is an interesting one, because I'm a big fan of the third parties because I think they play a really important role, but they play an important role for discovery. So the important thing is your restaurant can perhaps be discovered for the first time through a third-party channel. What restaurants need to figure out is how do you take a great experience from that discovery experience into then that first party. And that's where the investment into that first-party channel, into a frictionless kind of interface, is super important. And then the last thing I'll mention in reference to what you're saying is, then how does this come back to the employee experience? All of these things that we just talked about, with your cookie example, about how you can create a great experience for a customer. Well, what about for the employee? How can we use the information of what we know about our employees and their preferences? The fact that I might like to work on Sundays, but I've got, I always have to get back because the babysitter's here at 6 p.m. Those little bits of information can be so powerful for platforms like your own, right? And you think about the way in which this is going to evolve in being able to make sure that we're helping our GMs be able to schedule more effectively beyond all the things that we're currently doing.
Are you nodding, Vivian, to say something? Or
no, I'm just nodding and agreeing. Yes.
Sorry about that. I was like, I don't want to interrupt you.
I know there's so much more for me to talk about on that point, like Carl, because actually bringing in the employees who are kind of like your on the ground, like data collectors in many ways into the fold are super important. But I know that we're at time. So I want to pass it over to Alex and we're going to have another one of these conversations, continue it in the corridors of maybe RFDC next. But I'll pass it back to Alex.
Usually at the end of our episodes, Carl, I usually say, what's your kind of key thought from this conversation, or your key takeaway? What was something that kind of stood out for you just in this conversation that kind of got us all going?
Well, the key takeaway, I think, is that theme of we recognize the value of data, we recognize the complexity of data, but the fact that it isn't just in one component of our restaurant organizations. It's across everything from revenue management pricing with what we're doing at JUICER to what you guys are doing with employee scheduling, with Landed, and then similarly, the whole side of being able to help folks understand that if you use data right, then you can use it for marketing, you can use it for being able to drive a better omni-channel guest experience. And I think that ultimately is what we're all striving for. We're trying to help restaurants use data more effectively, and hopefully organizations like ours can help.
Great.
Yeah, I mean, my big one is like omni-channel guest experience. I mean, not just digital, not just drive-through, not just in-store, in-restaurant, but truly like an omni-channel experience. Like map that out, think about what the guest engages with like on all these different channels, and make sure that they talk to one another and make sure that the data flows between one another.
All right, great stuff. Well, that is the podcast. That is the episode. I want to thank Carl Osbourn for coming on and being our guest today. Thanks so much, Carl.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Vivian, thanks very much. And like I say, at the end of every episode, every restaurant has a story, and we're here to learn the playbooks that built the world's greatest restaurants and how you can apply them as a founder, owner, operator, or investor yourself. Thank you very much, and we will see you all next week.